Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Nina Hood and I'm the founder of the Education Hub, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what is our first webinar for 2023. Really excited to be back running our monthly webinar series, and very excited to be hosting our first speaker for the year, Professor Jodie Hunter. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before we begin. We are recording the webinar this evening, and we'll be releasing a recording on our website either tomorrow or Friday. And we do welcome questions throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Jodie, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will endeavour to feed those into the conversation. I'm just actually going to turn the chat on. Sorry, that's not enabled. There we go. You should be able to use the chat function now. And the webinar will run for around about an hour this evening. It's now my real pleasure to welcome Professor Jodie Hunter. Jodie is a professor at Massey University, and she's passionate about developing culturally responsive teaching, particularly for Pāsifika students in mathematics classrooms. And she's been involved in research and professional learning that involves working closely with schools and in classrooms with teachers to support a shift in pedagogical practices to better serve the diverse learners that comprise our classrooms in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Jodie, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here this evening.
Oh, kia ora, Nina. Thanks for having me.
So if we could start the discussion tonight with just you telling us a little bit about what effective mathematics instruction looks like in primary classrooms.
Yeah, so for me, thinking about effective mathematics instruction is thinking about how we can teach in ways that align with how mathematics is used outside of school. So often there's been a difference in what we can call school mathematics and how mathematics is used by mathematicians and other people just drawing on mathematics. So for me, effective teaching is really thinking about giving children opportunities to engage in mathematical practices. So those are practices that mathematicians draw upon. They can be things like giving mathematical explanations, setting children up to make conjectures, which is, people often ask me, what does a conjecture mean? You know, it's quite a mathsy term. So really it's just thinking, you know, when you might see 5-year-olds making a conjecture because they're adding two numbers together and they notice that it doesn't matter which order you add those numbers in, the answer is going to be the same. So that's a really nice example of a 5-year-old making a conjecture when you just hear those little children say, oh, look, when you add two numbers, yeah. And what we need to do as teachers is then pick up on that and get the children to explore that idea. Does it work? Does it always work? Does it work with subtraction? Does it work with larger numbers? Does it work with all different types of numbers? And then we can get children to explore that idea and then develop a proof for it. So for 5-year-olds, when I'm thinking about 5-year-olds, you might get them to get out some equipment, some concrete material, and they can see that it doesn't matter when you've got A and B. You can swap them around and you've still got A and B. And that's then getting children into generalising as well. So those kinds of things are really aspects of effective mathematics instruction. The other part I think about is, I think we're being effective when every learner in our class walks away from a lesson having learnt something mathematically. Yeah. So I think often we have this kind of illusion that everybody's going to learn the same thing and that we haven't successfully taught, or learners aren't successful unless everybody's learnt the same thing. But in fact, I think we need to widen that to think about what is all the mathematics that the children could learn from the lesson. And we're successful when children have learnt something, even if it isn't necessarily all of the same. Yeah, I guess the last part I'd talk about is using a range of task structures. So, and I know that we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I think it's really important for us to be using different types of tasks, different task structures. And then key is really thinking about teaching across different mathematical strands. And this is really important so that we can expose students to a wide range of mathematics, help them see connections across mathematics. But also the other part that's really important is giving children opportunities to show their strengths across mathematics.
Yeah. Nice. Lots of really great ideas, and I'm sure we're going to go back and unpick those as we go through the discussion tonight. Can I just come back to the point that you raised about one of the objectives of a lesson is every learner having learned something, but not necessarily the same things. And I think that will probably resonate with a lot of people, this idea that people are at different stages in terms of their learning. They're going to be engaging in different ways and get different things out of it. But within that, are there some sort of common outcomes that we ultimately want all of our mathematical learners to gain, even if they might be gaining those at different times and through different lessons?
Yeah, and I think the way I like to think about mathematics is that really you've got some big ideas which kind of comprise the basis of mathematics. So if you think about measurement and what are the big ideas of measurement, I like to use the analogy of a ruler, because a ruler is a really nice way of thinking about a whole lot of measurement, big ideas and concepts, which are all wrapped into one tool. So when you look at a ruler, it has units which are all the same size, no gaps between those, and they're lined up. So you've got iteration happening within that ruler. And measurement really is about kind of covering space. So whether it's area, you're covering the space, an area and volume and capacity, you're filling the space up. When you're measuring length with a ruler, you're covering the length of that line. So I think those are the kind of big ideas that we want children, all of the children, to have access to and opportunities to. Sometimes the difference, I guess, when I'm talking about learning different things is it might be that you've learned a similar big idea, but you've kind of grappled with it in different ways. So it might not all look the same, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know if that's clear.
No, it does. And I guess, that kind of goes back to also your point around wanting ultimately children to be generalizing ideas as well. And that once you've actually got to that generalizing idea, hopefully you've got a number of your students making the same generalizations, but from different starting points, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you could take that idea I was talking about. So for some children, they might work out that when you're going back to the generalization idea, so for some children, it might be that they walk away from the lesson knowing that 5 plus 4 is 9 and 4 plus 5 is 9. And that's their learning, where you've got other children who may walk away from that same lesson realizing that, 5 and 4 and vice versa, but actually that applies to any number. So they're all grappling with the same big idea, but they haven't necessarily all learned exactly the same thing there.
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. Thank you. So then in your work, you do a huge amount of work in schools, engaging with teachers in classrooms. What are some of the challenges or issues that you're seeing in maths classrooms at the primary level at the moment?
Yeah, so I think I'd go back to what I was talking about before about teaching across mathematical strands. So I think understandably, we, like many countries, had a big push on number and getting children to be, working with number and those kinds of things. But I think that's kind of led to a bit of narrow view of what mathematics is. So I guess for me, one of those issues is that when we have a narrow view of what mathematics is, it limits how we see children as successful in mathematics. And then that limits our teaching and learning. So I think rather than thinking that children have to understand this idea before they move on to this idea, we can introduce different ideas and children will grow their understanding of them because we can keep coming back to them and repeating them, if that makes sense. So I think sometimes we limit children by saying, they're not great at adding, so I'm not going to do fractions, instead of saying I can do adding and I can do fractions, and I can be confident that children will gain capacity in that. And then I also go on to things like algebra and patterning and geometry. And if we're holding back children from, if we think number is what makes you good at mathematics, then we miss out on all the children who have amazing spatial reasoning or patterning. Yeah. I mean, I look at my own daughters and I think one of them's like great number-wise and patterns and things like that. The other one needs a little bit more time to think about what she's saying. And you always need to say, go slow, think about it, and she'll get there. So I think, that's kind of a narrow view, is that you're good if you're fast and quick and time limited and stuff. Yeah. And that kind of feeds into this idea, I think, that we have, and it's not just here, but it's all over the world, that everybody's born with this kind of fixed mathematical ability. Yeah, and we hear it all the time, people saying, I haven't got much of a maths brain. And I was guilty of saying that myself, saying I'm good at teaching maths, but I'm not really a maths person. And then I had to check myself and think, what do I mean by that? Because I think actually everybody has a capability in mathematics for learning. And we as teachers and educators, if we're open to it, we can continue learning right throughout. So I go into a classroom, I can learn from children and learn different ways of looking at things and grow my mathematical capability. Yeah. So I think that's kind of that idea that mathematics ability is fixed is hugely problematic, and it's a big challenge. And I think we need to move past that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one. And I think that idea of being able to continually learn, absolutely something that I think a lot about. I was reading a chapter in a book where a teacher was talking about how they were teaching maths, and they explained a concept, and suddenly a light bulb went off in my mind. I was like, I knew the mathematical rule and what I needed to do in order to solve any sort of, problem that was put in front of me. This is going back 100 years when I was at school. But suddenly I understood why I needed to do that. And, it was sort of 20 years down the track, and suddenly I understood, why I was doing what I was doing. But yeah, that idea of learning is a really important one. Can I come back to one of the ideas you raised, because it's a really interesting one, because I think sometimes maths, and you've sort of emphasized that we shouldn't be thinking about maths in this way, but maths is sort of seen as a linear progression, right? And this idea that you can't get to different math skills if you haven't got ones before, and then you can sort of chart the route if you need to go to here, to here, to here, to here, and then you ultimately get to here. But you're suggesting that actually we might not want to be too fixed in the way we think about it.
No, and I definitely think children need strong building blocks and foundations, but I don't think that learning is ever like this. I think it's more like this. Yeah. If that makes sense. And maybe hopefully it's like this, but yeah, but I don't think it is like that. And I think mathematics is such a wide area. So yeah, I mean, you've got, like I was talking about before, you've got number, but you've also got kind of spatial reasoning and geometry and things like that. And they interconnect, but it's not this kind of linear of having to, know this to know this to know this. Yeah. There's natural progressions, I think, that we can work on and build upon. But but I guess the idea of us as teachers putting a lid on what children are exposed to is a slippery slope for myself. Yeah.
That makes really good sense. So your work has focused a lot on the use of culturally responsive approaches to teaching and learning in mathematics in primary school. Can you talk a little bit about what some of these approaches might be and what they look like when they're being enacted in a classroom context?
Yeah, so I'm always thinking about who the students in front of me are. So what experiences do they have outside of school that connect to mathematics? What are their values, their home values? What are the strengths that they're bringing into my classroom? So what language strengths do they have? Do they have strengths in their home languages? Do they have strengths in the way that they work with their parents or wider family and with their siblings? And how can you utilize that as a teacher to really accelerate children's progress in the classroom? That's one part of it. I think we need to be thinking about the types of tasks that we use. So I think, and I mean, I made that point earlier, I think we use a range of tasks. Sometimes I think in primary schools in New Zealand, we kind of maybe slid too far into everything has to be in a context. I don't think everything does have to be in a context. I think using decontextualized abstract mathematical tasks is a great balance to using ones in contexts. When we do use ones in contexts, I think it's important to include ones which connect with genuine mathematical situations that children have in their lives, if that makes sense, or cultural artifacts which are familiar to them. So I've been lucky enough to do some interesting work at some schools in South Auckland looking at how young children, 6 and 7 year olds, generalise algebraic growing patterns. And we used a basis of cultural patterns. So we took like Sasa, for example, and thought of how you can look at Sasa as a growing pattern with counting claps and slaps and the kind of patterns that you have in that. We looked at things like using te vai, which, is the Cook Island quilts. So how you could, and it was eye-opening for me, to be honest, because my grandmother's Cook Island, and I was at visiting her, and I looked at a cushion that she was sewing, and I was like, oh, that's got like a linear growing pattern in it. So, and I'd never thought about it that way. So I think I was just in Niue, and I was looking at the necklaces, kahoahihi, which is like shell necklaces, and thinking about all of the patterns that were embedded in there and how we can use that as well. And yeah, so I guess where I'm coming to is when I think we think about those kind of familiar patterns, it helps children access the mathematics easier, if that makes sense. So what we found in the schools in South Auckland that we worked with was that when we used kind of some typical patterns like building blocks and things like that, and we found the children could work at a higher mathematical level and generalize at a higher mathematical level when we used tasks which were familiar to them, familiar patterns like te vai and things like that. And I'd just I don't know how you prove something like this. To me, I think it's because the children could access the context, so they could grapple with the mathematics at a higher level instead of having the cognitive load of trying to access the context, if that makes sense, which happens sometimes when you use that kind of decontextualized aspect. And then I think your second part of that, so you've got your tasks sitting here, and you do have to be careful with that, because I think if we're going to use a task set in a cultural context, we don't want to be tokenistic about it. So you do have to think very carefully about, and I always play a little game with the kids with that, because I think, like, we want kids to go up to what if the pattern was 100 times, and I'm using a te vai cushion or a quilt, and yeah. So I take that into the kind of, obviously this is not going to happen, but I'll say to them, like, what if we had a giant quilt that filled up the whole hall? What rule could we use for that? So you're kind of taking it out of, you're not pretending that you would actually have 100 of that pattern. You make it obvious that that's not, yeah, but you've also got to kind of think about how do you weave that throughout the maths lesson so that we don't appropriate somebody's culture and basically position it so it's only valuable because it's mathematical. Te vai and sasa, they have value in themselves. So, yeah, they have value as cultural activities in themselves, as well as the mathematics that we can see in it. So you've got to weave that in. Yeah, and I guess in the other side that I talk about is thinking about our pedagogy. So that's thinking about, okay, in a lot of cultures, we want children to engage in mathematical argumentation, to disagree with ideas. That's really important. But in a lot of cultures, not just Pacific culture, but also in, I know for Korean students, for example, it's rude to disagree, and it's seen as impolite and disrespectful. So rather than then just not doing that, we've got to think about how can we reposition that practice in drawing on the children's values to make children say, actually, you can disagree, but there's polite ways that you can do it. And when you disagree in maths, you can do it in a way that's actually helping somebody, not shaming them. Yeah. And so I think sometimes it's also helpful to think about the cultural metaphors that we could use. So I go back to te vai. I'm just doing this because it's part of my culture. So, so I like to talk to the children about if you're making a te vai, you're sitting with a group of mamas and you're stitching it, and you stitch wrong when you're learning and you do a wrong stitch, they'll say, hold on, have a look at what you've done there. Now you need to unpick it and redo it. And you can use that as an analogy of how do we work together in mathematics, which is the same kind of thing. If somebody's doing something which you don't quite agree with or you don't understand, you can say very politely, I'm not sure about that idea. Can you explain it a bit more? Or I don't agree with that idea. And then you can go back and undo that and then pick it up and keep going with it. And at the end of it, with the te vai, if you hadn't disagreed, you're going to end up with a messy, ugly creation. Whereas after unpicking it and redoing it, you end up with a taonga, and that's the same in mathematics. If you respectfully disagree, you could end up with a beautiful creation that everybody's learned from and can share together, or vice versa. You don't say anything, it ends up with something that doesn't quite work.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jodie, when teachers are thinking about how they could potentially utilize cultural artifacts within the mathematical tasks that they are developing, for some teachers, they're not necessarily going to be coming from the same cultural backgrounds as their students. They're not necessarily going to have strong knowledge in those areas. So do you have advice or thoughts for them about how they can approach that? And I think, this comes back in part to your idea of ensuring that we're also not taking a tokenistic approach with this as well.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things I'd say. I've had some really interesting research project where we asked children, and I think you could do this as a homework activity, basically. So we gave cameras to children in Niue and also out in South Auckland, and asked them to take photographs of where they thought mathematics was involved in their lives. And then we got them to basically tell a story about it, not tell a mathematical story, just tell the story of what they were doing. And from that, it gave us a real window into the authentic mathematics in the children's lives. And I think we can widen culture too, because a lot of the children brought in photos, not just of cultural activities, it is still a cultural activity, but of building things and playing with toys and games and things like that. And that's culture as well, that's your everyday real lived culture. So I think, we can turn it around to think about how students themselves can be resources, and that comes across the curriculum. We can talk to parents about it. But I also think there's a lot of, I spend a lot of time doing research myself because, like I say, I'm from Cook Island background, but I've been working in Niue and developing tasks there. And I, readily would say I don't have the experience and the knowledge. So I use the internet a lot to look it up. CocoNet, which is a website, is a really, really great resource because you can look up, how to make things, what the names are, what they use, and I've used that as a huge resource, so I think it's a bit of time, but you draw up a really good bank. Yeah. Like I had a student who bought Fiji and Massey, and we wanted to develop a fractions problem, and we decided to develop a fractions problem thinking about the dye that you use for Massey and how it's made. Yeah, so I just spent quite a bit of time looking up, well, how do you make the dye, and finding out that the black is made from ash and soot and mixing it together, and then thinking about what would be the ratios that you'd use. Yeah, so, I think we've got huge resources through parents, through children, and through the internet, and we can draw on those. And once you've got those, I think, I guess you've got that kind of bank there that you can draw upon. And it might be a bit of work to start with, but in the end, you've got a whole heap of resources. Yeah. And I think from my other kind of thing I do now is, when I was talking about this, I just kind of hijack people at the airport when I was catching the flight to Niue, because I was like, oh, your necklace is amazing and they've got really good patterns in them. Do you mind if I take a photo? So, so I do that quite a bit, not just to random people all the time, but when I'm out and about, I try and I've kind of got a maths lens going on. So I'll take photographs of things when I'm out and about, because I think I'm looking for the maths that already exists. I guess it's turned it around for me, where I think instead of contriving a situation to fit a maths topic, I'm always looking for the mathematics in the world around us, and then trying to capture that in the moment to bank to use later on. So, yeah.
I love that. And when you actually stop to think about all the maths that's around us all the time, it's huge. In the mathematical thinking, I think about it because this is completely random, but kind of connected. As part of the Education Hub work, we're looking to develop some resources around maths in early childhood. And I've got 2 young boys, both preschool age. And so just when we're playing, I'm thinking about all the maths that they are just doing in the context of your kind of run-of-the-mill regular play. And it's everywhere. And it's amazing once you stop to actually think, oh, wow, that is actually developing some really interesting mathematical concepts there.
For sure. Yeah. So I just think we can kind of, use our own mathematical eyes to find it around us, and that's really helpful. Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I think in schools often we have a great resource with other teachers and with teacher aides who you can talk to and, you know, collaborate with to really develop these kind of rich contexts.
And when you're thinking about developing these tasks, are you finding that you're able to develop tasks that are drawing on cultural artifacts across all strands? Or are there some strands where you feel it fits better than others?
No, I mean, I think that I can do it right across all strands. And I think it's really important to address that. And then I also think that you kind of take a wide view of culture again, because like a local skate park is part of people's cultural identity. So, you know, I always think we have that ethnicity identity, but then we also have kind of popular culture that we can build on. So, yeah, you know, and then like I said before, I think there's also space to have decontextualized tasks as well. And that's important, you know, and I think kids like playing around with numbers and things like that, or shapes. And yeah. So I think, I mean, honestly, when I'm looking at the tasks that we develop and we've been developing, I can really weave them across any different type of mathematics. And often you can have this like one kind of piece of one activity has multiple links to different types of mathematics.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Now, we've just had a question pop up, and I'm not sure whether you're going to be able to answer this, but I'll throw it in there anyway, and then we'll sort of see where we go from there. So we've had a question in, how does this compare to prime maths, which is based on popular Singapore maths? Not sure if you...
I'm not an expert in prime maths. Yeah. So, and I don't like to talk about other people's work, which I don't know too well. Yeah.
No problem at all.
I mean, I guess so I have been asked this before, and I think the work that we do, like I'm talking a lot about culture and things like that. I don't know what prime does in that. The one thing I do know about prime is that it is really thinking about structuring children's thinking towards mathematical ideas. And I know, I mean, again, I think prime is based on Singapore maths, but it's not necessarily what teachers do in Singaporean classrooms, having been to Singaporean classrooms and worked with colleagues from there. But I think the parallels between our work and work that prime does, for example, is that we're, you know, I'm talking about culture and all of those kinds of aspects, but at the key of what we want to do, I'm also thinking about using series of tasks which teach children the big ideas and the concepts, you know, so having a very clear structure to get children to a mathematical goal. And from my understanding, I think prime has the same kind of, it might look different in how you're doing that, but their goal is to get children to mathematical learning and goals by having a clear series of tasks. So I guess that's kind of similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really nice way to start actually digging a bit deeper into this idea of tasks, because I know that this is something that you've become really interested in over the last couple of years. So could you just tell us a little bit about why you have focused so intently on this idea of the task?
Yeah. So we had a really interesting research project that we started doing about 3 or 4 years ago, where we wanted to start kind of capturing profiles of what teaching looked like after professional development. So in the schools that we're doing professional development, we would go into some of the classrooms, and we had developed this profiling tool with a colleague from Canberra University, Robin Jorgensen. And the profiling tool was really looking at 3 components. So it was looking at like the intellectual quality of the lesson in terms of a profile, cultural connections, and then kind of a well-being aspect. And it was looking at what teachers do in terms of pedagogy. So we kind of mapped out the pedagogies to align with those. And then we look really in this profile, we're looking at, is this teacher action or pedagogy present in the lesson, or is it not present? That makes sense. Yeah. And really one of the big things that came out of it in the first year was that the task that the teacher was using was just so important. So basically, if the task was not at a challenging enough level, or it was kind of a bit of a flawed task, then everything else fell down around it.
Yeah.
So that just started kind of getting me to think about just how important it is. And I also found that another kind of interesting thing was we were looking, it wasn't just a one-off with one teacher, but we would go back and look at the lessons in this teacher's class. We've got kind of between 4 to 8 observations or profiles of the same teacher, and so the same teacher using 2 different types, using different tasks, could have really highly effective pedagogy because the task was really highly effective, and then the same teacher may have a task which was not challenging enough for the children or didn't quite hit the mark, and it looked like a totally different teacher. That makes sense. Yeah. So that was kind of interesting to me, because I guess I'd previously thought that an effective teacher is an effective teacher no matter what they're teaching, but actually it kind of signaled, oh, there's a little bit more to this than that. The second part of it is, I think we've got this, it's borne out in the national monitoring, it's borne out in TIMS and PISA and those kinds of international tests, which basically is that children kind of progress in school, but by about year 4, we're starting to get gaps between children, and that just grows and grows and grows. Yeah. And my kind of conjecture, I suppose, about that is that I think a lot of it is to do with not using tasks which are set at the appropriate curriculum level. So using tasks, with year 3s that actually really focus on a kind of level 1 curriculum concepts rather than thinking about what the level 2 are. And I guess I'm not at all trying to deficit theorise about teachers, because I think our teachers are very hardworking. Every teacher wants to do the best by their students. But I also think that, and I think back to my own teaching, it's really easy for us as teachers to design 1 or 2 really good tasks off the bat, but it's really hard to design a series of tasks which map to each other and keep progressing and keep progressing. Yeah. And that's the thing I think's been missing. So you can go to NZ Maths and you can get a task from here, or you can get a task from there, but that kind of idea about a set of tasks. So that's kind of become a little bit of a focus for me, is to think about how can we have 10 tasks which build on each other and keep children progressing, and then, and use those in year 1, and then have a different 10 tasks in year 2, which are going to keep the children progressing, Yeah, so a bit more structure, I guess.
But I mean, I think there's so much to explore here, and it's quite exciting, because I've been harping on about Richard Elmore's work and his whole idea that task predicts performance for years, and now I'm talking to you, and this is, you're right along there with me, so it's very exciting. But I think what's really fascinating is that, yes, there's that, what is the individual task, but it's also, how does that individual task fit within a broader sequence or progression, and actually thinking really carefully about that. And then we're getting into really complicated, complex territory, right? In terms of what it is we're expecting teachers to be able to do.
Yeah, and I guess I'm always trying to think about, what can I do as an educator to support teachers, and what can I do as an educator to help teachers teach the best that they can. So to me, I've been kind of channeling that into developing sets of tasks that we're sharing with teachers and getting them to use, and really closely monitoring what's happening when these tasks are used and the outcomes.
Yeah. And so what are you, let's go with, so what are you finding, when you are monitoring teachers utilising those tasks, and sort of what are some of the things that you're finding out in your research?
Yeah, so we've had some really exciting results from some of the schools that we've been working at. So I can give you some examples where we had one school with year 7 and 8 students, and I mean, I did a lot of cross-checking to see that this is correct. And we'd been looking at whether the children could see basically algebraic structures and kind of equivalent number sentences. So we give the children a task which has kind of number sentences that you can match together and then generalize from. And before the school was using the tasks, the children probably, I think it was about 20% of the children could see, and this is at year 7 and 8, so 20% of the children could identify the kind of related and number sentences and then make a conjecture or generalization from them. Most of them just solved the equations rather than making any connections. And I think you can look at that and say those children really, you're saying about 80% of them aren't working at level 4 in the curriculum, if that's what they're doing. Yeah. And so same school the following year, they'd used the tasks that we'd designed, and we had 90% of the children. Yeah. So it was like, to be fair, I was very, very surprised by that myself, like to the point where I was like, are these the same children? Like, maybe it's just a different cohort, or yeah. And so I got one of our researchers to go back and back map it and work out it was matched data. And basically, yep, the year 7s were new cohort, but the year 8s we could do the matched data, and it was the same group of children. There hadn't been much transition in that group or anything like that. Yeah. So I mean, that was like, yeah, 5 weeks of teaching. Hugely different results. So, and I'm not saying that's for absolutely everything, because I look at our kind of what we've been doing with fractions, and I think there's a lot of work to go with that, but definitely we've got much more children. I guess what I've noticed in the achievement results that we're tracking is there's less spread. Yeah, and that's what really is, I think, a great outcome, is that we're narrowing that spread. So yeah, it isn't to say that it's becoming narrower down this way.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm really hoping that you're narrowing it by bringing the bottom up.
Yeah, we are. We're definitely narrowing it by bringing the bottom up. So it's kind of, it's moving. And I think something like fractions where, like fractions, I guess I would say, is something that's quite iterative. I don't think you hold kids back from it, but they're hard concepts to develop. So you have to kind of keep coming back to them, keep going. Yeah. So I think that kind of spiraling back is really important. And I guess I look at our stuff and I'm never quite satisfied. I'm like, oh no, this needs to be better. This needs to be better. But, I definitely seeing positive shifts in that. So yeah, it's really exciting. And I guess for the other part that's been really awesome with this work we've been doing is the feedback we've been getting from teachers who have been talking about how much mathematics they're learning as well. Yeah. So I had one. That. Yeah. So, we've had teachers talking about working through solving the problems themselves and really learning the mathematics. Yeah. I mean, it's just going back to that idea about learning all the time. So when I'm writing these tasks, I don't just write them off the top of my head. They take me hours and hours to do, because I'm looking into a whole lot of research about the trajectory and the types of tasks to use and the best practice and all of that kind of stuff as well. So I'm learning, I'm learning a lot of maths myself, even though, I've got a PhD in maths education,
And through that work, Jodie, have you managed to sort of identify sort of the key components that make really great mathematical tasks in primary school education? So like, if you were then, say, looking at tasks that other teachers or other people have created, would you be able to sort of say, okay, I can provide some sort of assessment as to the quality of that task based on certain principles?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I go for that kind of multiple entry points is really important. So yeah, so you've got to have multiple points where the children can enter and exit, if that makes sense. Yeah, so because I loop back to that idea about every learner walking away from a lesson having learnt something. And so I don't want to have tasks which are inaccessible to particular children in the classroom. I want to have tasks which everybody can access. And you want to have that kind of, sometimes I think you need to multi-tier the tasks, if that makes sense. And by what I mean by that is not say you're giving this set of tasks to one group and this set to another, but I quite like to make parallel sets of tasks. So if you're taking something like addition, for example, the numbers that you're expecting children to add might be, you might have 3 tasks with 3 different sets of numbers, and therefore you're kind of creating challenge through the different sets of numbers that you're using, but you're giving everybody access to those 3 tasks with the different sets of numbers, not saying only you can solve this and only you can solve that, because often you can be really surprised by what children are really capable of as well. Yeah. So I don't know if that kind of, sorry, I probably went a little bit off topic there. Yeah,
no, so I was sort of thinking about how you assess the quality of your task. So you've suggested, this idea of multiple entry and exit points are a key thing to look for. Is there anything else that you think is a really important thing for teachers to be thinking about?
Yeah, I also think about connecting to these kind of big mathematical ideas. So sometimes we can go wrong with a task because it's not really maths, or it can be approached in a non-mathematical way.
Could you give an example of what something like that would be?
That's a good question.
Sorry, just throwing you on the spot.
Yeah. I should think about, like, I was going to say making a clock, but I mean, so, yeah, because sometimes I think making a clock can be a little bit problematic, where you're just kind of going into technology as opposed to, yeah.
I kind of get what you're saying. So it's about thinking about, what is essentially the tasks that's going to gift these students the greatest opportunity to engage with the mathematical content, the mathematical ideas that we're wanting them to be engaging with.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. And I think, again, like coming back to multiple different task structures. So like when I'm doing measurement tasks or fraction tasks, I like to put in tasks which get children to directly confront potentially erroneous thinking, Yeah. So, and right from 5 years old, so I've been designing some of these tasks where you show children, you say, oh, so-and-so measured like this, and you might show them a picture where somebody's tried to measure something but left gaps in between, or they've used measurement units of different sizes. And then I'll have in that, what did they do well? Because I think, kids often, it's good to be positive because often there's things that we can find that people did well. And then, what did you think they did not so well? And what would you suggest to them that they could think a little bit more about? Yeah. So you're kind of getting the children also to directly consider other people's thinking and kind of address those kind of potentially erroneous ideas. Yeah.
Nice. And I'm going to come to a couple of questions that we've got coming through on the chat.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I think this one might refer back to when you were talking about the idea that making sure that you are providing your students with sort of age or level appropriate challenge and making sure that you're teaching at the curriculum level that they should be at. So for teachers who might be teaching in composite classes that sit across multiple levels of the curriculum, how should they be approaching that within their own classrooms?
Yeah, so I think that you've got a couple of options there. It depends what your class composition is like. Sometimes, I do get asked this quite a bit, and sometimes I say, well, if you've got an even split, then you could just split your class in half and teach the year 3s and then the year 4s in 2 separate groups, for example. That's one way you can do it. I'm always tending to orient towards probably the higher level than the lower level, if that makes sense. Yeah. And then mix across both of them as well. So, yeah, because I think you could just, I guess when you're thinking about teaching to big ideas and big mathematical ideas, sometimes it's the numbers that make the difference, not the actual big idea. So the size of the number could be the thing which is throwing children off, so you could experiment with what, but I always kind of say push until you know that the children absolutely can't access it, rather than make it so easy that they can solve it really easily. Yeah.
And I guess if you're drawing on that idea that you discussed about ensuring that tasks have different entry and exit points, that also becomes a way of catering for students that might be at different levels within the same class.
Yeah. And I think so much of the maths that we do is accessible across a range of levels anyway, so, I think probably where you start thinking it is a little bit harder is your number stuff, because numbers in themselves can be like exclusionary because of children's reactions to seeing bigger numbers, but if you start thinking about like algebra and growing patterns, really it's just, you might say what would the 100th pattern be? But with younger children, you might say, what would the 10th pattern be?
Yeah.
Yeah. But the big ideas and the principles behind that are the same.
Yeah. And I get this is another question that sort of you've started to address, but just asking again about accommodating for the diverse learners and the multiple levels and what you would pitch to. And basically, am I correct in thinking you sort of pitch as high as you possibly can without losing the ones that might need the
Yeah, and I think that you think about different parts of your lesson. So at different parts of your lesson, children may drop in and out, if that makes sense. Yeah, but I also think that we can think of children in a kind of collective sense. And I've seen some amazing lessons where children who were seen as the kind of lower kids have come up with these amazing mathematical ideas, which the teacher's gone, whoa, never thought they would, you know. Yeah, so I don't think it's always easy, like that whole classifying children by levels is a little bit problematic, because I don't think you are classified by a level. I think you might show, you know, that's I don't know, you get into problematic areas there when you think that a child is a level 2 or is a level 3. Because again, if you go back to the richness of mathematics, that child might be that in number and fractions, but in geometry and position and orientation, they've got a totally different skill set. And in algebra and patterning, they have a totally different skill set as well. Yeah. So I think it's giving the children the opportunities to show, you know, where their strengths lie, build on those, getting other children to notice them as well. Yeah. I go back to my own children and I think about my 9-year-old who you could quick fire basic facts at her and you'd think she was hopeless at maths, you know, because she's just not, doesn't respond well to that. But with, you know, puzzles and spatial awareness, she's fantastic at doing that. With, you know, building Lego structures, she's amazing at that. And that's all mathematics. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jodie, we've had a question about how do teachers get hold of these wonderful tasks that you are creating?
Oh, we do have a Facebook group, so called Developing Mathematical Inquiry Communities on Facebook, which has got lots of people participating on there. People can email me and I can give them more information about that. We do offer them to all the schools who are taking our professional learning and development. And we've been offering this year, and I don't want to sound like I'm selling anything here because I'm not, but we're looking at like running teacher content knowledge workshops and giving out the tasks for that as well. So mainly because we have been sharing them quite widely, but we're also cognizant that we want people to be able to know how to use those and dig into the mathematics with support as well. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, people can always email me. They can go onto the Facebook group and get in touch with us as well. Yeah. So.
And that raises an interesting question for me, because when you're thinking about sort of supporting teachers to be utilising these rich mathematical tasks in their teaching and sort of have those sequenced as well, how much support and guidance do teachers need in terms of how to effectively utilise those in their practice versus just being able to sort of run with it?
Yeah, I think that actually, I don't know if it's how much support or how much work do you need to do, or maybe it's both. If that makes sense. Yeah, so what we've done in the tasks, we've kind of designed these task booklets, which basically have the task, have the big mathematical ideas, have a range of learning outcomes, have the mathematical language, give you possibilities for how you could what different ideas you could connect to when children are sharing back their solutions. And then we have a whole lot of teacher notes about thinking about how to launch the task, what you need to notice and respond to, you know, all of those kind of aspects. So I think, yep, people do need to kind of have some support, but then I think some people could take those and run with them, and that's fine. The one thing I think that everybody needs to do is really spend the time anticipating what your students will do with the tasks. Yeah. So solve them yourselves and think about what are all the different solutions that might come out of that. Because if you don't do that, then I think often instead of being able to teach effectively and walk around and recognise what children are doing, instead you're walking along trying to work out what on earth the maths is, and it just means that you miss a whole lot of opportunities. Yeah. I mean, it's not always possible. I've had like some of the tasks I've used with algebra, I get surprised at what younger children have done. I've learned a lot in the lessons, and I've sat there with the teacher and anticipated stuff and not come up with what the kids actually did with it. Yeah, but yeah, you can learn from that yourself anyway. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I could go into a big, long discussion here, but, you know, I think it's difficult because when we go into teaching, we're usually going off how we've been taught, and a lot of the time we're not necessarily going in with a great deal of mathematical pedagogical content knowledge. Yeah, and I know teacher education struggles with the time needed to do that. Yeah. So, you know, so I think that's kind of a whole thing which I acknowledge. And primary school teachers are experts in everything. Yeah. So.
And we've had a question through around how teachers should be thinking about assessment alongside, say, utilising your task, and what that might look like.
Yeah, so I think you've got kind of your two forms of assessment which are really helpful to think about. So obviously you've got your assessment which you can be doing as children are working in the moment. And what we've tried to do with the tasks that we've developed is really map out all of the possible learning outcomes. I'm not saying it's an exhaustive list on what we've done, but so that teachers can use those to notice and think, oh, yep, they're doing that, you know, and so you can kind of map that out. And then you've got your kind of more summative assessment. And I guess the way I like to position assessment is to think about it as assessing our teaching. That makes sense. Yeah. So I think the two types of summative assessment which I think are really useful is, one, we've actually designed these kind of open-ended tasks, which, like I was talking about, so like it might be a whole lot of number sentences which are equivalent, and you ask the children to match them, and then you ask the children to make generalization from them and give other examples. And so they're not right-wrong tasks. They can show a whole spectrum of mathematical learning within the one task. And I talk to people about using those as a really low stakes assessment as well, giving them as independent task and letting children have the time to think about it and to write onto it and, you know, show off the maths that they've learnt. The second part, I think PATs are a good tool if we're using them again to think about our teaching, because if you're using PATs effectively, you can look across your teaching and across the school and think about, what's some things that I need to potentially address a bit more as concepts that the children haven't understood. Yeah. So I'm not really into using PATs as a way of categorizing children, but I think they're a really good tool for us to think about how we're teaching and what we need to potentially address with our children a little bit more.
Brilliant. Jodie, we're very fast coming to the end of our time. This has been such a fascinating discussion, and I know that people have got so much out of it, and I'm sure you're going to get lots of people now sending you inquiries about how they learn more about the work that you're doing. I just wonder if you'd like to leave us this evening with sort of a couple of key takeaways that you'd like teachers teaching mathematics, particularly in the primary years, to be thinking about, to have front of mind when they are undertaking their teaching.
Yeah, so I guess I think it's using that kind of strengths-based focus is really important. You know, so I'd love to see teachers going in and looking at what students are doing and thinking about all the multiple ways that you can be good in a mathematics classroom, you know, that you can be successful in a mathematics classroom. And I don't mean that as, you know, everybody's a winner kind of mentality. I mean the genuine good ways. You know, so you have some children who are amazing at giving an explanation, other children who are amazing at kind of, you know, I've had kids who I taught who were just really good at critical thinking and getting other children to explain their thinking by asking kind of critical questions all the time. You know, then I've had other children who are really good at taking a risk. You know, so all of those processes, as well as the mathematical kind of concepts and contexts, are ways that we can be good at mathematics. So I think rather than labeling children as levels and that kind of thing, that we're better to think about all the strengths that the kids are bringing and how that kind of adds collectively to our classroom culture. And I guess the other kind of key thing is that I've had children from Pacific backgrounds who have said things to me which have really made me feel very upset. So I've had children, when I've asked them, how do you feel being the culture that you identify within the maths classroom, who have said things like, oh, it's weird being Tokelauan in the maths classroom because Tokelauans don't do maths. Or, you know, Samoan child who said, well, I have to be a Pālangi in the maths classroom, and then at the end of maths, I can go back to being Samoan again. So I think we have to really think about what we're doing as teachers to make sure that children don't say things like that. So the reverse of that is one of the schools where that child said that, Tokelauan child said that 3 years later, after we've been working with the school for the PD, the teacher, we asked this, you know, children, different children, but the same question. And one of the children said, oh, I'm Tokelauan, and my culture's in the maths that we do, and my culture's in everything we do at school, and my culture should be in everything that we do at school. You know, so I think, what do I take away from that? That what we do as teachers is powerful, and we can really make a change to how children see themselves in mathematics.
Brilliant. Well, on that really powerful note, we will end this webinar. Jodie, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you tonight. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I know that everyone else on the webinar has also just gained so much from it. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge and also your passion for mathematics. It's so important. And here's to making sure that all children see themselves as being mathematicians and able to succeed in the maths classroom.
Cool, awesome. And thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for coming along this evening. It's been wonderful to host you. Have a fantastic evening. Good night.